Hey guys! Tonight we slip through the torchlit halls of Hampton Court Palace, where the air smells of wax and damp velvet, and the echo of boots on stone feels like a heartbeat. Picture yourself brushing past tapestries, their threads glinting, with scenes of hunts and kings, as you catch a whiff of roasting meat from a distant feast. You're here to uncover the horrible death of Henry VIII, England's larger-than-life monarch, whose final days in 1547 were a mess of pain, politics, and palace whispers. This isn't a quick exit. It's a slow, grim unraveling, and honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the stench of his sick room, let alone the court's scheming. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I love picturing where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a shadowy corridor, the kind where secrets cling to the walls like damp. It's January 1547, and Henry VIII, once England's golden king, is a fading giant. The man who broke with Rome, married 6 times, and ruled with an iron fist is now a wreck, his body betraying him while his court holds its breath. You're not here for his glory days, the jousts, the feasts, the beheadings, but for the end, when illness and intrigue turned his palace into a chessboard. To understand his death, you need to feel the weight of this moment, where every whisper could shift a kingdom. Let's start with a mainstream fact. Henry VIII's health began seriously declining in the 1540s, ravaged by obesity, leg ulcers, and possibly chronic infections, as court records from 1546 note. At 55, he's no longer the athletic prince who dazzled Europe. He's a mountain of a man, carried in chairs because his legs can't hold him. You're catching glimpses of servants scurrying past, their faces tight with worry, because the king's not just sick, he's mortal, and that's a problem for everyone. His death isn't just personal, it's political dynamite, threatening England's fragile stability after years of religious upheaval and war. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Henry's court used smelling bottles filled with rose water or cloves to mask the odor of his festering leg wounds during audiences. Imagine you're a courtier, holding one of these tiny glass vials to your nose, trying to nod politely while the king rants. It's like a medieval air freshener, but no amount of cloves can hide the truth. Henry's falling apart, and the palace knows it. You're sniffing the air now, catching a faint whiff of lavender from a passing lady, and wondering how anyone kept a straight face. But not everyone agrees on what was killing him. Historians still argue whether Henry's decline was due to a single disease like diabetes or Cushing's syndrome, or a mix of lifestyle and bad luck, with no definitive diagnosis in surviving records. Some point to his jousting injuries, others to his massive diet of meat and wine. You're starting to sense the palace's unease, because nobody knows how long he'll last, and that uncertainty's breeding fear. If you're a courtier, you're watching every grimace, every cancelled meeting, wondering who'll hold power when the throne's empty. Step closer to a massive oak door, carved with Tudor roses, and notice the details. The cool brass of the handle, the faint creak of floorboards, the way the torchlight flickers like it's nervous too. This palace isn't just a home, it's a stage where Henry's death is rewriting England's script. You're feeling the weight of his reign, the monasteries he dissolved, the wives he discarded, the enemies he crushed. Now, he's the one being crushed, not by a rival but by his own body. It's ironic, almost poetic, and you're wondering how a man so mighty got here, hobbling toward his end. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's court carry so many fans? To wave away the smell of his bad days. You're smirking, imagining a lady fluttering one furiously. But the mood's heavy. You're catching whispers, servants muttering about the king's temper, nobles eyeing each other like wolves. Henry's death isn't just a medical event. It's a power vacuum waiting to happen. His son, Edward, is only 9, and the courts, already splitting into factions, each sniffing for advantage. You're not a player in this game, but you're close enough to feel the tension, like static before a storm as you linger by the door. You're starting to see the bigger picture. Hampton Court's a glittering cage, holding a king who's both tyrant and victim. You're thinking of his 6 wives, some beheaded, others outlived, and how they're shadows in this story. You're wondering about Edward, the boy who'll inherit this mess, and the doctors who must be sweating as much as the servants. The palace is alive with fear and scheming, but it's also quiet, waiting. Henry's not dead yet, but his decline's a drumbeat, and you're here to follow it, step by painful step, through the halls where power and pain collide. One last chuckle. Why did the palace torches burn so dim? Because they knew the king's light was fading. Okay, maybe they were just low on oil, but you're feeling the gloom settle in. You're ready to move deeper into this world, past the tapestries and whispers, to see how Henry's body and his kingdom started crumbling under the weight of time and ambition. You're gliding through the opulent halls of Hampton Court, the clink of your imaginary boots muffled by rush-strewn floors, as the scent of polished wood and faint sweat lingers in the air. Tapestries ripple in the draught, their colors muted by torchlight, and you're a silent observer in January 1547, drawn to the heart of Henry VIII's world. The king himself is somewhere nearby, hidden behind guarded doors. No longer the strapping figure of Tudor legend, but a shadow of his former glory. You're here to witness the transformation of Henry's once mighty frame. How the athletic monarch who dazzled courts became a swollen, suffering invalid. This is the physical unraveling of a titan, and you're close enough to feel the weight of his decline, like a storm cloud over the palace. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's physical condition deteriorated sharply in his final years, largely due to obesity and chronic leg ulcers, as documented in diplomatic reports from the 1540s. Once a towering 6-foot athlete who excelled at jousting and tennis, by 1547 he weighs over 300 pounds. His mobility crippled by painful sores likely caused by old injuries or infection. You're picturing him now, a mountain of velvet and fur, his face flushed with pain as servants hoist him onto a padded chair. The court still bows, but their eyes flicker with pity or calculation, because this isn't the king who hunted stags or charmed ambassadors, it's a man fighting his own flesh. Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry's tailors crafted massive padded doublets to flatter his growing bulk, sometimes stuffed with wool to exaggerate his shoulders and hide his waist. In 1546, wardrobe accounts list garments wide enough to fit 2 men, with gold thread to keep up the royal sheen. You're imagining a seamstress, needle in hand, stitching furiously to make Henry look like the warrior he once was, while you catch a glimpse of his reflection, a king drowning in fabric, his pride as swollen as his legs. It's like a medieval Photoshop fail, and you're half smirking, half sad, wondering how he faced that mirror. But not everyone agrees on what fueled this decline. Historians still argue whether Henry's weight gain and ailments stemmed from metabolic disorders, like type 2 diabetes, or simply overindulgence in feasts of swan and venison. With no clear answer in medical records, Some point to a 1536 jousting accident that left him unconscious, possibly triggering chronic issues. Others say his lavish lifestyle, think 5,000 calories a day, was the real culprit. You're weaving through courtiers now, their murmurs low, and you're sensing the debate in their glances. Is this the king's fault, or fate's cruel jest? Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's doublet need so much padding? To cushion his ego and his throne. You're chuckling, but the mood's heavy, the palace air thick with unease. You're dodging a servant carrying a tray of spiced wine, their eyes downcast, as you move closer to the king's presence. Picture the scene. The hall's grand, with high ceilings and stained glass windows catching the winter light. But there's a hush, like everyone's holding their breath. You're not near Henry yet, only his inner circle sees him now. But you can feel his decline in the court's rhythm. Servants whisper of the king's great chair, a wheeled contraption to move him between rooms. It creaks louder than his once booming voice. His legs, scarred from old wounds, ooze and stink, despite the rosewater vials we sniffed last time. You're imagining the pain, sharp and constant, and the humiliation for a man who once danced till dawn. It's not just his body failing, it's his myth, the invincible king crumbling before your eyes. Step closer to a gilded door, guarded by a yeoman in scarlet, and notice the details. The faint tang of medicinal herbs seeping through, the nervous shuffle of a page boy, the way the torchlight dims like it's morning. This palace, with its feasts and finery, is a facade for a king who can't walk unaided. You're thinking of his youth, when he wrestled French dukes and wrote love songs for Anne Boleyn, and how that man's gone, replaced by this bloated, angry shell. His body's a battlefield now, each ulcer a wound no armor can shield. You're wondering how he bears it, if he rages or weeps when the curtains close, and what it means for England when its lion can't roar. Here's another chuckle. Why did Henry's chair have wheels? Because even his throne couldn't keep up with his temper. You're grinning, but it's fleeting. The yeoman's stare is cold, and you're reminded of the stakes. Henry's decline isn't just personal, it's shaking the kingdom. His court, those whispering nobles will meet soon. No, a weak king means a weak England, with France and Spain circling like vultures. You're feeling the ripple effect, his pain, his pride, his power slipping away, and the court's starting to shift, like sand under a tide. As you linger by the door, you're starting to see the bigger picture. Henry's body isn't just failing, it's a symbol of his reign's endgame. You're remembering those smelling bottles, how they hid the truth, and wondering about the lies the court's telling itself. His 6 wives, his frail heir, the religious wars he sparked, they're all tied to this moment, this man who reshaped England, now undone by his own flesh. The palace hums with life, but it's holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. You're not here to mourn yet, but to watch, step by step, as Henry's strength ebbs and the Tudor world braces for what's next. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did Henry's doctors look so grim? Because his ulcers outranked their cures. You're slipping past the guard, the corridor stretching ahead, as the palace's pulse quickens. With Henry's decline sharpening, you're ready to dive deeper into the court's fears, carrying the weight of a king who's no longer larger than life. You're lurking in the flickering shadows of Hampton Court's outer courtyard, where the air smells of wet cobblestones and the faint musk of horses stabled nearby. Torches sputter in iron brackets, casting jittery light on courtiers huddled in clumps, their velvet cloaks brushing as they whisper with guarded glances. It's January 1547, and you're a silent observer, catching the nervous pulse of the Tudor court as Henry VIII's health crumbles behind palace walls. The king's decline isn't just a private tragedy, it's a public crisis. And you're here to overhear the court's whispered fears, the dread that's spreading like damp rot. This is the palace holding its breath, and you're close enough to feel the chill of their uncertainty, like a draft you can't shake. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's worsening condition in late 1546 and early 1547 sent shockwaves through his court, as recorded in letters from ambassadors like the French envoy Charles de Marillic. With the king bedridden, suffering from festering leg ulcers and unable to lead, courtiers feared for England's stability. His death would leave 9-year-old Edward as king, a child surrounded by ambitious nobles and a kingdom split by religious reform. You're catching snippets of talk. The king's leg worsens. Who'll guide the boy? And you're sensing the panic beneath their polished bows. The court's not just mourning Henry, it's bracing for a power struggle that could crack the Tudor dynasty. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some courtiers carried pomanders, orange rinds studded with cloves, to ward off disease and bad luck, believing Henry's illness might curse the palace. In 1547, jewelers' accounts show a spike in these scented charms, worn on chains like medieval hand sanitizers. You're imagining a lord sniffing one nervously, his eyes darting as he mutters about the king's fever. It's like clutching a lucky rabbit's foot, and you're half smirking, picturing a pomander swinging wildly during a heated whisper. But the fear's real. Nobody wants to catch whatever's felling Henry. But not everyone agrees on the court's mood. Historians still argue whether the fear was genuine or a performance, with some nobles exaggerating their worry to curry favor or hide schemes, as hinted in cryptic council notes. Some, reading diplomatic dispatches, say the court was paralyzed by dread of civil war. Others argue savvy players were already plotting, using Henry's decline as cover. You're weaving through these cloaked figures, their voices low, and you're wondering who's sincere and who's playing chess with the throne, their loyalty as shaky as the torchlight. Time for a quick joke. Why did the courtier clutch his pomander so tight? Because he thought Henry's cough was contagious power. You're chuckling, but it's quiet. These whispers are too tense for loud laughs. You're dodging a page boy with a stack of letters, his face pale. As you edge closer to a knot of nobles, picture the scene. The courtyard's alive with muffled steps, the clink of spurs, and the rustle of heavy cloaks, but it's subdued, like a feast gone sour. You're not close to Henry's sick room yet, but his absence looms, like that massive doublet we saw, too big for the man now. Courtiers, lords in fur, ladies in jeweled hoods cluster like nervous hens, their words clipped. You hear names: Seymour, Dudley, Norfolk, each tied to a faction eyeing the boy King Edward or the council that'll rule for him. The fear's not just about Henry dying, it's about what happens next. England's broke from wars, split between Catholic and Protestant, and a child on the throne spells chaos. You're feeling their dread, sharp as the January wind cutting through your cloak. Step closer to a stone archway and notice the details. The slick moss underfoot, the faint whiff of cloves from a passing lady's pomander, the way a torch sputters, like it's eavesdropping too. This courtyard's a stage, like the palace halls we walked, but it's raw, exposed. You're thinking of those smelling bottles from Henry's audiences, how they hid his decay, and now the court's hiding its own fear dressed in velvet. You're wondering about the men whispering here. Are they loyal to Henry, or already betting on his son? Some fear a Catholic uprising if Edward's Protestant Tudors win. Others dread a foreign invasion. You're catching a lord's mutter. If the king falls, so does order, and it's chilling, like a prophecy. Here's another chuckle. Why did the courtiers whisper so softly? Because the palace walls had better ears than the king. You're grinning, but its fleeting and noble's glare makes you shrink back, your cloak blending with the shadows. You're also thinking about the stakes, Henry's decline. That swollen frame we saw isn't just a man's end, it's a kingdom's hinge. You're remembering his 6 wives, how their fate shaped this court, and Edward, a boy who barely knows his father's shadow. The courtiers' fear ties them to you, an observer who sees the cracks, fear of chaos, of losing favor, of a world without Henry's iron grip. You're wondering who'll rise when he falls, and if they'll survive the storm. As you slip toward a side gate, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This courtyard isn't just a gossip hub, it's a microcosm of England trembling. As its king fades, you're thinking of those padded doublets, hiding Henry's truth, and how these whispers hide the courts. The fear's real, but so's the scheming. And you're caught in its current, like a leaf in a river. The palace hums with life, but it's fragile, waiting for Henry's next breath or his last. You're not here to judge, but to listen, to feel the court's pulse as it races toward a future nobody can predict. One last joke to ease us. Forward. Why did the court's torches flicker? Because they knew the king's light was going out. You're gliding past the gate, the whispers fading, as the palace looms darker. With the court's fears ringing in your ears, you're ready to step closer to Henry's side, where doctors fight a losing battle to save their king. You're creeping through a narrow passage in Hampton Court, the walls damp and close, the air thick with the sharp tang of medicinal herbs and something sour, like sweat gone stale. The flicker of a single candle guides you, its light bouncing off stone as you approach a guarded door where physicians huddle, their voices low and urgent. It's January 1547, and you're a silent shadow, here to witness the desperate, often bizarre efforts of Tudor doctors trying to save Henry VIII from his crumbling body. The king's ailments, those festering leg ulcers, that swollen frame, we saw are beyond their skill, but they're scrambling to delay the inevitable. You're diving into the world of Tudor medicine, where hope battles ignorance, and you're feeling the futility like a weight on your chest. The mainstream fact is that Tudor medicine in the 1540s was rudimentary, relying on humoral theory and herbal remedies, as detailed in medical texts like the Castle of Health 1541 by Thomas Eliot. Henry's doctors, led by figures like William Butts, treated his ulcers and fevers with poultices, bloodletting, and concoctions of mercury or boiled roots, believing his humors were imbalanced. You're peering through a crack in the door, watching a physician smear a foul paste on Henry's leg, his face grim as the king groans. These treatments often did more harm than good mercury could poison. Bloodletting weakened, but the doctors had no concept of infection or antibiotics, just prayers and guesswork. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Tudor physicians used unicorn horn powder, actually narwhal tusk, as a cure-all for royal ailments, believing it neutralized poison. In 1546, apothecary records show Henry's doctors sprinkling this pricey dust into his tonics, hoping it'd cure his fever. You're imagining a bearded doctor, mortar in hand, grinding what's basically a sea creature's tooth, and grinning at the absurdity. It's like tossing glitter on a wound and calling it medicine. You're half tempted to whisper, "Try soap instead," but the guards would have you out faster than you can say quack. But not everyone agrees on the doctor's intent. Historians still argue whether Henry's physicians were genuinely trying to heal him or just prolonging his life to avoid blame, with no clear motive in their sparse notes, some citing Butts's loyalty, say they worked tirelessly, driven by duty. Others, reading court intrigue, argue they feared execution if Henry died too soon, padding their efforts with showy cures. You're catching the doctor's nervous glances, their hands trembling as they mix potions. And you're wondering if they believe in their craft or just dread the axe. Time for a quick joke. Why did the Tudor doctor carry so many herbs? To hide his panic from the king's glare. You're chuckling softly, but the passage's gloom swallows the sound. Those guards are too close for comfort. You're sidestepping a puddle, the candle's wax dripping, as you strain to see more. Picture the scene. The room beyond the door is small, stuffy, with a brazier smoking and shelves crammed with jars, dried leaves, murky liquids, maybe a vial of that unicorn dust. Henry's out of sight, but his presence looms, his groans cutting through the physician's murmurs. You're not in the courtyard with its whispered fears or the hall with its padded doublets. You're at the edge of the king's suffering, where medicine's a desperate art. The doctors apply leeches to draw bad blood, or burn the ulcers with hot irons to cleanse them. Each act a stab in the dark. You're wincing, imagining the pain, and wondering how Henry endures it, his temper flaring even as his strength fades. Step closer to the door and notice the details. The acrid bite of mercury in the air, the faint clink of glass vials, the way the candle's flame wavers like the doctor's confidence. This room's a battlefield, like Henry's body we saw crumbling. But it's futile, a fight against time. You're thinking of those pomanders the courtiers clutched, warding off plague, and how these doctors clutched their remedies, warding off failure. The king's ulcers, likely infected, defy their pastes. His fevers, possibly septic, laugh at their tonics. You're feeling their frustration, their fear, because a dead king means a dead career or worse. If the court blames them, here's another chuckle. Why did the physician's potion smell so bad? Because it was brewed with hope and desperation. You're biting your lip, because the doctors' faces are drawn, and you're sensing the stakes. You're also thinking about Henry's court, those factions we overheard, circling like hawks. The doctors aren't just fighting disease, they're fighting politics. If Henry dies too soon, the Seymours or Dudleys might point fingers, claiming neglect. You're wondering if these men dream of miracles or just pray for time, each leech a plea for mercy. You're remembering the king's youth, that athletic prince, and how these cures mock his lost vigor, like a cruel jest. As you linger, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just about failed medicine, it's about a kingdom on the brink, tied to a king who's more patient than ruler now. You're thinking of those smelling bottles, masking Henry's decay, and how these potions mask the truth. He's dying, and no herb can stop it. The court's fears, the whispers we caught, pulse here, in this room where science and superstition collide. You're wondering about Edward, the boy waiting in the wings, and the wives whose ghosts haunt this palace. The doctor's battle is yours to watch, a losing fight that's pulling England toward a new, uncertain dawn. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did the leech look so tired? Because it couldn't suck away Henry's fate. You're slipping back into the passage. The doors crack, narrowing, as the physicians' voices fade, with their desperate remedies lingering. You're ready to step closer to the women who shaped Henry's life, their shadows fading as his own light dims. You're drifting through the long gallery of Hampton Court, where the air smells of polished oak and the faint rose water of a passing lady's perfume. Tall windows let in gray January light, 1547, casting shadows on portraits that line the walls. Stern faces of Tudor nobles, their eyes seeming to follow you. You're a silent observer, pausing before a row of painted queens, their silks and jewels frozen in time. Henry VIII's 6 wives: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr stare back, their stories woven into the king's life, and now his creeping death. You're here to reflect on their fading shadows, how these women shaped Henry's reign and haunt the palace as his body fails, their presence a quiet echo amid the court's tension. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's 6 marriages, spanning 1509 to 1547, were central to his reign, reshaping England's religion, politics, and succession, as chronicled in court records and letters. Each wife left a mark. Catherine of Aragon's defiance sparked the break with Rome, and Boleyn's fall birthed the Church of England. Jane Seymour gave him Edward, and so on. Now, as Henry lies bedridden, his leg ulcers festering like those we glimpsed, only Catherine Parr remains, a steady hand guiding the court. You're standing before Jane's portrait, her pale face serene, and feeling the weight of their legacies, knowing Henry's death will shift the spotlight to their children nor lack thereof. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tudor queens often gifted Henry embroidered shirts, really tunics, a wifely duty that doubled as a status symbol. In 1546, Catherine Parr's household accounts list fine linen shirts she stitched for Henry. Even as his health crumbled, each thread a nod to tradition. You're picturing her sewing by candlelight, her needle steady despite his groans, and grinning at the irony. It's like knitting a sweater for a sinking ship. You're half wondering if she slipped a prayer into the seams, hoping to outlast him. Her survival a quiet triumph over the ghosts of her predecessors. But not everyone agrees on the wives' impact. Historians still argue whether Henry's queens were pawns or players in his court, with some, like biographer Antonia Fraser, saying they wielded subtle power, while others, citing their fates to beheaded, to divorced, argue they were victims of his whims. You're gazing at Anne Boleyn's sharp eyes, her fate sealed a decade ago, and wondering if she shaped him more than he broke her. Her daughter Elizabeth, a shadow waiting in the wings. The court's whispers, those fears we overheard, carry their names, as if their spirits linger, judging Henry's end. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's queens love their portraits? Because they outlasted his temper on canvas. You're chuckling, but it's soft. The gallery's hush demands respect, and a servant's glare keeps you moving. You're sidestepping a creaky floorboard, eyes flicking between the queen's faces. Picture the scene. The gallery's grand but somber, with dust motes dancing in the light and the distant clatter of a servant's tray breaking the silence. You're not in that physician's room with its feudal potions or the courtyard's scheming nobles. You're in a space of memory where Henry's wives feel both distant and close. Catherine Parr, the only living queen, is elsewhere, managing Edward's education or soothing Henry's pain. Her role as nursemaid outshining her predecessor's drama. You're pausing by Catherine Howard's portrait, her youth frozen before her 1540 to execution, and feeling a pang her flirtations cost her head, while Parr's caution keeps her alive. The court's tension, that drumbeat of dread, hums here, tied to these women who loved, fought, or fell. Step closer to Jane Seymour's frame and notice the details. The cool brass of the plaque, the faint creak of the gallery's beams, the way her painted hands clutch a prayer book, serene despite her death after Edward's birth. This space is a shrine, like those pomanders warding off fear. But it's also a warning. Henry's love was a battlefield, and his decline reopens old wounds. You're thinking of Catherine of Aragon, exiled for failing to bear a son, or Anne of Cleves, dismissed for not sparking his desire. Their stories: divorce, death, Survival mirror the court's current scramble, as nobles eye Edward and fear a regency. You're wondering how Parr navigates this, her sewing a shield against Henry's fading wrath. Here's another chuckle. Why did the Queen's jewels shine so bright? Because they had to outsparkle Henry's bad moods. You're smiling, but it's bittersweet. Jane's calm face reminds you of her sacrifice, giving Henry his heir at her life's cost. You're also thinking about the present, Henry's death. That slow decay we saw in his swollen frame casts these women in new light. Parr's the last queen standing, but Edward's mother, Jane, looms largest, her son the court's hope. You're feeling their absence, their triumphs, their tragedies, all tied to a king who reshaped England through them. The gallery's quiet, but it's alive with their echoes, each portrait a story of power won or lost. As you turn from Jane's image, you're starting to see the bigger picture. These wives aren't just shadows, they're architects of Henry's reign. Their fates shaping the court's fears we heard, the doctor's desperation we watched. You're remembering those smelling bottles, masking Henry's decay, and how these women masked their own struggles, from Catherine's defiance to Parr's diplomacy. The palace hums with their legacy, as Edward's future and England's faith hang in the balance. You're not here to mourn them, but to carry their stories, each a thread in the tapestry of Henry's horrible end, pulling you closer to the boy who'll inherit this fractured world. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did the Queen's portraits never fade? Because their strength painted over Henry's flaws. You're gliding past the gallery's end, the portrait's eyes lingering, as the palace darkens. With the wives' shadows fading, you're ready to focus on Edward, the heir whose future looms over Henry's dying days. You're standing in a quiet corner of Hampton Court's chapel, where the air smells of incense and polished pews, and stained glass windows filter the pale January light of 1547 into shards of red and gold. The distant murmur of a choir hums, but your eyes are on a small figure kneeling at a prayer desk. Prince Edward, Henry VIII's 9-year-old son, his slight frame dwarfed by a velvet doublet. You're a silent observer, here to ponder the uncertain future of this boy, the longed-for heir who carries England's hopes as his father's life ebbs away. Henry's decline, those festering ulcers and wheeled chair we glimpsed, casts a long shadow over Edward, and you're feeling the weight of a kingdom resting on a child's shoulders, fragile as the candle flickering nearby. The mainstream fact is that Edward VI, born in 1537 to Jane Seymour, was Henry VIII's only surviving legitimate son, making him the key to Tudor succession, as confirmed in the Third Succession Act of 1544. With Henry bedridden, his death imminent, Edward's youth poses a crisis. England needs a strong king, not a boy guided by regents. Court records from 1547 show nobles already maneuvering to control the prince's council, with Edward's education in Protestantism shaping him as a reformist hope. You're watching him pray, his lips moving silently and sensing the pressure. He's not just a child, but a pawn in a game where faith, power, and survival collide. Here's a quirky tidbit. Edward kept a princely diary, a notebook where he scribbled thoughts on governance, even as a boy, with entries from 1547 describing court events in a child's earnest hand. You're picturing him sneaking a quill under the covers, jotting notes about his father's illness, his tiny script trying to make sense of a crumbling world. It's like a medieval kid's blog, and you're half smiling, imagining him hiding it from his tutors. But the stakes are deadly serious. Those words could guide a kingdom or betray his fears. But not everyone agrees on Edward's readiness. Historians still argue whether he was a precocious ruler in waiting, or a frail child overwhelmed by expectation, with no clear verdict in his sparse writings. Some, citing his later reforms, say he showed early brilliance, shaped by tutors like John Checky. Others, noting his sickly frame and sheltered life, argue he was unprepared for the throne's weight. You're studying Edward's pale face, his eyes fixed on the altar, and wondering if he's praying for his father or for himself, caught in a future he can't yet grasp. Time for a quick joke. Why did Edward's diary have so many smudges? Because his crown was too big for his quill. You're chuckling softly, but the chapel's solemnity stifles it. A nun's glance makes you shrink back. You're sidestepping a pew. The candles glow your guide as you watch the prince. Picture the scene. The chapel's hushed, with velvet cushions on the pews and a gold crucifix gleaming above. You're not in the physician's stuffy room, or the gallery with its queen's portraits. You're in a sacred space, where Edward's future feels like a prayer half answered. He's alone, but not tutors hover nearby, their whispers sharp with plans. You're feeling the court's tension, those courtyard fears we overheard, pulsing here. Edward's the answer to Henry's obsession with a male heir, the reason Jane died, the hope Catherine Pargards. But he's a boy, not a king yet, and the nobles we saw Seymour, Dudley circle him like wolves, each wanting a piece of his reign. You're wondering if he senses it, if those prayers are for strength or escape. Step closer to the prayer desk and notice the details. The worn leather of Edward's prayer book, the faint tremor in his hands, the way the incense curls like a question. This chapel's a refuge, like those pomanders warding off dread, but it's also a stage. Edward's been raised to rule, drilled in Latin and theology, but his world's crumbling. Henry's decline, that massive frame we saw, is a countdown to a crown he's too young to wear. You're thinking of the wives, how their fates led to this boy, and the doctor's futile potions, buying time for this moment. You're feeling the fragility, like a glass goblet teetering on a table's edge, because if Edward falters, England could fracture. Here's another chuckle. Why did Edward pray so hard? Because he hoped God would do his homework and his reign. You're smiling, but it's tender. His small shoulders carry too much, and you're aching for him. You're also thinking about the stakes, the court's scheming, those whispered factions, hinges on Edward. If Henry dies soon, as seems likely, the boys' council will rule. But who'll lead it? Protestants like his uncle Edward Seymour push reform. Catholics lurk, dreaming of Mary, Henry's daughter. You're remembering the Queen's portraits, how their struggles birthed this moment, and wondering how Edward, a Protestant puppet, will navigate a divided realm. His diary might hold clues, but it's locked away, like your own thoughts, as you linger by a pillar. You're starting to see the bigger picture. Edward's not just Henry's heir, he's the pivot of a kingdom teetering on faith and power. You're thinking of those smelling bottles, masking Henry's decay, and how Edward's youth masks the court's chaos. His future ties to everything: the physician's desperation, the courtier's dread, the wives' legacies. You're wondering if he'll rise or break, if his reign will heal England or deepen its wounds. The choir's chant swells, Edward's head still bowed, and you're carrying his quiet strength, a flicker in the storm. As you prepare to step closer to the king's final, darkened world, one last joke to ease us forward. Why was Edward's crown so shiny? Because it was polished, with everyone's ambitions. You're slipping from the chapel, the stained glass dimming, as Edward's silhouette fades. With his uncertain future heavy in your mind, you're ready to enter Henry's sick room, where death's shadow grows darker. You're easing through a heavy oak door into the stifling gloom of Henry VIII's private bedchamber at Surmise Palace, where the air reeks of medicinal salve and the sour tang of unwashed linens. The room's dim, lit only by a few guttering candles, their wax pooling like tears on a side table. It's late January 1547, and you're a silent shadow, standing just beyond the velvet canopy of a massive four-poster bed where Henry lies, his bulk barely stirring under embroidered covers. The court's whispers, those fears we caught in the courtyard, are hushed here, replaced by the labored rasp of the king's breath. You're here to enter the heart of Henry's sick room, a place thick with illness, secrecy, and the creeping certainty of death. And you're feeling the oppressive weight, like a shroud settling over the room. The mainstream fact is that by January 1547, Henry VIII was confined to his bedchamber, his condition critical, as noted in Privy Council records. His leg ulcers, worsened by possible infection or venous disease, oozed and burned, while fevers and immobility signaled a body shutting down. The room was sealed to all but his closest physicians, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and Catherine Parr, with strict orders to keep his state's secret treason to predict the king's death. After all, you're catching the strain in a physician's face as he adjusts a bandage. The king's grown low but sharp, and you're sensing the room's isolation, a world apart from the bustling palace we roamed, where hope is as scarce as fresh air. Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry's bed was fitted with a trussing bed, a mechanical contraption with pulleys to lift and turn his massive frame, easing the strain on his sores. In 1547, carpenters' accounts describe this early hospital bed, rigged with ropes like a ship's rigging. You're picturing servants cranking it, their arms trembling under the king's weight, and grinning despite the grimness. It's like a medieval gym machine, but for a dying monarch. You're half wondering if Henry cursed its creaks. His pride stung more than his legs, as you watch the bed's shadow loom on the wall. But not everyone agrees on the secrecy's purpose. Historians still argue whether the council hid Henry's condition to maintain stability, or to consolidate power before Edward's reign, with no clear intent in their guarded letters. Some, citing the treason laws, say it was about preventing panic. Others, noting Seymour's rise, argue it let factions position themselves, controlling who saw the king. You're noticing the gentlemen's tense glances, their hands hovering near daggers, and wondering if they're guarding Henry's life or their own futures. The room a powder keg of loyalty and ambition. Time for a quick joke. Why was Henry's bed so creaky? Because it groaned louder than his temper. You're chuckling softly, but the sound dies fast. The physician's frown is a warning, and the air's too heavy for levity. You're edging closer, avoiding a tray of bloody cloths, as you take in the scene. Picture the scene. The bedchamber's claustrophobic, with dark tapestries swallowing light and a brazier smoking in the corner, adding to the fug. You're not in the chapel with Edward's prayers or the gallery's painted queens. You're in a tomb-like space, where Henry's decline is no longer rumor but raw truth. His face, half hidden by pillows, is swollen and gray, his once fierce eyes dulled by pain. Servants move like ghosts, swapping bandages or offering wine he barely sips. Catherine Parr, a shadow by the door, watches with calm resolve. Her role as nursemaid a far cry from the doomed passions of Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard we reflected on. You're feeling the room's despair, a king reduced to a patient, his power leaking with every labored breath. Step closer to the bed and notice the details. The sticky scent of salve, the faint clank of the trussing bed's pulleys, the way a candle's flame trembles like it knows the end is near. This chamber's a fortress, like those pomanders fending off fear. But it's also a prison, trapping Henry in his failing flesh. You're thinking of the doctor's potions we saw. They're mercury and leeches useless now, and how this room seals their failure. The secrecy's suffocating, nobody speaks of death, but it's here, in the king's shallow breaths, in the gentleman's hushed orders. You're wondering what Henry thinks, if he fears God's judgment or rages at his body's betrayal, his reign slipping like sand through his fingers. Here's another chuckle. Why did the servants tiptoe so much? Because even the floorboards feared Henry's wrath. You're smiling, but it's fleeting. The king's cough, wet and weak, pulls you back. You're also thinking about the court beyond, those factions we heard plotting. The secrecy here fuels their whispers, as Seymour's and Norfolk's vie for Edward's counsel. You're remembering the wives, how their fates led to this boy king, and Edward's diary, scribbling a future nobody can predict. This room's a pivot, where Henry's end meets England's next chapter, and you're feeling the strain, like a bowstring stretched to snapping as you hover by the canopy. You're starting to see the bigger picture. This sick room isn't just Henry's, it's England's, holding a kingdom's fate in its stale air. You're thinking of those smelling bottles, masking decay, and how this secrecy masks the chaos brewing outside. The court's fears, the doctor's desperation, the queen's echoes all converge here, where a king's last breaths could spark war or reform. You're wondering about Edward, waiting in his chapel, and how this room's silence will shape his crown. The candles burn low, the king's chest rises slower, and you're carrying the weight of this moment, ready to feel the pain that's pulling Henry closer to his end. One last joke to ease us forward. Why was the sick room so quiet? Because death was louder than the king's roar. You're slipping toward the door, the physician's murmurs fading as the chamber's gloom lingers. With Henry's sick room heavy in your senses, you're ready to dive into the pain that defined his final days, a king undone by his own body. You're standing at the foot of Henry VIII's massive four-poster bed in the surmised palace sick room, the velvet canopy above you swallowing what little light escapes the dwindling candles. The air is sour with the stench of infection and the cloying bite of herbal sobs, and the room feels like it's holding its breath. It's late January 1547, and you're a silent witness, close enough to see the king's swollen face, slick with sweat, as he shifts weakly under heavy blankets. The trussing bed's pulleys creak faintly, a reminder of his immobility. And you're here to feel the relentless grip of Henry's pain, the chronic ailments that are dragging him toward death. This is the king's body at war with itself, and you're immersed in the agony that's stripping away the last of his strength. Heavy as the silence around you, the mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's final weeks were dominated by excruciating pain from chronic leg ulcers and recurrent fevers, likely exacerbated by infection or septicemia, as noted in Privy Council reports from January 1547. His ulcers, open sores on both legs, had plagued him for years, possibly from a 1536 jousting injury or venous insufficiency, and now they're inflamed, leaking pus that no poultice can stem. You're watching a physician gingerly lift a bandage, the king's low moan cutting through the room, and you're wincing at the raw, red flesh beneath. His obesity, pushing 350 pounds, worsens the strain, his heart and lungs laboring under the weight, each breath a battle against his failing frame. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tudor doctors sometimes applied puppy plasters, made from boiled dog fat, to draw out bad humors from wounds like Henry's. In 1547, apothecary logs mention such remedies, with servants scouring London for plump pups to sacrifice for the king's relief. You're picturing a grim-faced physician smearing this greasy mess on Henry's leg, and grinning despite the horror. It's like a medieval spa treatment gone rogue. You're half imagining Henry, once a hunter, growling at the indignity, but the pain's too fierce for pride, and you're sobered by his labored gasps. But not everyone agrees on the cause of his agony. Historians still argue whether Henry's pain stemmed from a single condition, like osteomyelitis bone infection, or a cascade of issues: obesity, diabetes, or even syphilis, though evidence for the latter is thin. Some, citing his fever patterns, lean toward septicemia. Others, noting his weight, point to heart failure. You're studying Henry's face, twisted in a grimace, and wondering what's killing him faster: the sores, the fever, or the sheer exhaustion of a body pushed past its limits. The physician's hushed debates, barely audible, echo the uncertainty, their hands as helpless as the candle's fading light. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's ulcers throw a party? Because they knew they'd outlast his crown. You're chuckling, but it's hushed the rooms too grim for mirth, and a servant's sharp glance keeps you still. You're edging around a table cluttered with vials, the air stinging your nose. As you take in the king's suffering, picture the scene. The bedchamber's a cave of despair, with dark tapestries, a smoky brazier, and the trussing bed's ropes sagging under Henry's bulk. You're not in the chapel with Edward's prayers or the physician's frantic mixing room. You're at the epicenter of pain, where Henry's reign is dissolving in sweat and groans. His legs, bandaged but seeping, are propped on pillows, the skin around them swollen and hot. You're feeling the heat radiating from him, the fever spiking despite willow bark tonics. Catherine Parr, a quiet figure in the corner, dabs his brow, her calm a stark contrast to the physician's panic. You're sensing the intimacy of this moment. A king reduced to a man, his power no match for the body betraying him. Step closer to the bed and notice the details. The sticky reek of pus, the faint creak of the bed's pulleys, the way Henry's fingers twitch, clutching at nothing. This room's a crucible, like the court's whispered fears we overheard. But it's personal, raw. You're thinking of that wheeled chair, how it carried a king who once jousted, and those puppy plasters, a desperate stab at relief. The pains, relentless ulcers burning, fever spiking, joints aching under his weight. You're wondering how he endures, if he curses God or his doctors, or if he's too weak to rage. You're feeling the isolation, the secrecy we sensed last time, sealing this room like a tomb, where even Parr's touch can't soothe the fire in his flesh. Here's another chuckle. Why did Henry's bed smell so bad? Because his pain was louder than his perfumes. You're biting your lip, because his cough, ragged and wet, drowns out any humor. You're also thinking about the court outside, those factions circling Edward. Henry's pain isn't just his, it's England's, fueling the scheming we heard. You're remembering the queens, how their fates led to this frail heir, and the doctor's potions, useless against this tide. The pain ties it all: court, crown, legacy into a knot of suffering. And you're wondering if Henry knows his end is close, if he fears the judgment waiting beyond. As you hover by the canopy, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just a king's agony, it's the unraveling of a reign. Each moan a step toward England's next chapter. You're thinking of those smelling bottles, hiding decay, and how Henry's pain hides nothing now, stark and undeniable. The court's dread, Edward's prayers, Parr's steady hand, they converge here, where a king's body is losing its last battle. You're wondering about the boy who'll inherit this, and the kingdom teetering on his pain's edge. The candles flicker lower. Henry's breath slows, and you're carrying the weight of his suffering, ready to see the politics swirling as his life fades. One last joke to ease us forward. Why was Henry's pain so stubborn? Because it wanted to rule longer than he did. You're slipping toward the door, the bed's shadow lengthening as the room's gloom clings, with Henry's agony searing your senses. You're ready to navigate the court's power plays, where death's approach sharpens every ambition. You're weaving through the crowded privy chamber of Surmise Palace, where the air hums with the rustle of silk and the sharp scent of cloves from pomanders. Clutched by anxious nobles, candlelight dances on gilded walls, but the mood's tense, like a bowstring pulled taut. It's late January 1547, and you're a silent observer, brushing past lords in fur-trimmed robes, their whispers sharp with ambition. Henry VIII lies dying just beyond the guarded door we left, his pain-soaked groans muffled but ever-present. You're here to navigate the swirling court politics, the factions vying for power as the king's life ebbs, each noble eyeing the throne that 9-year-old Edward will soon inherit. This is a chessboard of loyalty and betrayal, and you're feeling the electric charge of a kingdom on the brink, like static before a lightning strike. The mainstream fact is that as Henry VIII's health failed in January 1547, his court became a battleground for control over the Regency Council that would govern for young Edward VI. As detailed in Privy Council records and ambassadorial dispatches, two main factions emerged: the Protestant Seymours, led by Edward's uncle Edward Seymour, pushing reform, and the conservative Howards, tied to the Catholic Duke of Norfolk, seeking to preserve traditional faith. You're catching a Seymour ally, his voice low, plotting to secure the council's leadership, while a Howard supporter glares, clutching a rosary. The king's death, that agony we felt in his sick room, isn't just a loss, it's a power vacuum, and these men are racing to fill it before Henry's last breath. Here's a quirky tidbit. Courtiers used ciphered letters, coded messages written in secret alphabets, to plot safely during Henry's final days. In 1547, diplomatic archives show nobles like John Dudley passing notes with symbols or reversed script, dodging treason charges. You're picturing a lord scribbling one now, his quill scratching under a cloak, and grinning at the spy movie. Vibe, it's like medieval WhatsApp, but with wax seals and a side of paranoia. You're half tempted to peek over his shoulder, but the guard's watchful eyes keep you moving, your imaginary cloak blending with the crowd. But not everyone agrees on the faction's motives. Historians still argue whether the Seymours and Howards were driven by ideology, Protestant versus Catholic, or raw ambition, with no clear intent in their guarded correspondence. Some, citing Seymour's later rise as Lord Protector, say he genuinely sought reform for Edward's reign. Others, noting Howard's imprisonment in 1546, argue it was survival, each side grabbing power to avoid the other's axe. You're weaving through these plotting nobles, their faces masks of loyalty, and wondering who's playing for faith and who's just playing the game. Their whispers as tangled as the palace's corridors. Time for a quick joke. Why did the courtier's cloak have so many pockets to hide his schemes from the king's spies? You're chuckling, but it's hushed. The privy chamber's no place for levity, and a lord's sharp glance makes you shrink back. You're dodging a servant with a silver tray, the clink of goblets loud, as you listen to the buzz of intrigue. Picture the scene. The chamber's a hive, packed with nobles in jewel-encrusted doublets, their voices a low drone of deals and threats. You're not in Henry's sick room with its stench or the chapel with Edward's prayers. You're in the heart of power, where the court's fears we overheard in the courtyard take shape. A Seymour man boasts of Edward's Protestant tutors, while a Howard ally mutters about Mary, Henry's Catholic daughter, as a fallback. You're feeling the heat of their rivalry. Each were to move in a game where the prize is England. Henry's pain, that relentless grip we felt, fuels this chaos. His death means a child king, and these men want to steer the crown before it falls. Step closer to a marble pillar and notice the details. The cool stone under your fingers, the faint whiff of wax from a noble's ciphered letter, the way a candle's flame sways like the court's allegiance. This chamber's a crucible, like the trussing bed holding Henry's dying frame, but it's alive with ambition. You're thinking of those puppy plasters, a desperate doctor's trick, and how these factions are just as desperate, stitching together plans to outlast the king. The Seymours push Edward's claim, banking on his youth. The Howards, weakened by Norfolk's fall, scramble for leverage. You're wondering who'll win, if Seymour's confidence is as solid as his swagger, or if a dark horse waits in the wings. Here's another chuckle. Why did the noble's whisper sound so nervous? Because even his secrets feared Henry's ghost. You're smiling, but it's fleeting. A guard's clanking armor pulls you back. You're also thinking about ties to the past. The queens we saw, their fates shaping Edward's claim haunt this room. Jane's son is the prize, but Catherine Parr's steady hand guards him. You're remembering the doctor's futility, those leeches failing Henry, and how these factions thrive on that failure. Their ciphered plots a mirror to the court's dread. The politics here are a dance, each step calculated, and you're feeling the rhythm, the pulse of a kingdom teetering as Henry fades. As you slip toward a tapestry-covered wall, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just a power grab, it's England's future being carved in whispers, each faction betting on Edward's reign or its collapse. You're thinking of those commanders warding off fear, and how these plots ward off chaos, or invite it. The court's tension, Edward's prayers, Henry's pain, they converge here, where ambition outshines loyalty. You're wondering about the boy king, if he'll bend under this weight, and the kingdom he'll inherit, already fracturing. The chamber's hum grows sharper, Henry's absence louder, and you're carrying the spark of this intrigue, ready to probe the faith that haunted his final days. One last joke to ease us forward. Why was the Privy Chamber so crowded? Because everyone wanted a seat at Edward's table. You're gliding past the nobles, their whispers trailing, as the room's heat lingers, with the court's politics crackling in your ears. You're ready to explore Henry's spiritual turmoil, the last battle of a king facing eternity. You're kneeling in the dim royal chapel at Surmise Palace, where the air is thick with the scent of melting wax and the faint must of old prayer books. Stacked in the pews, the flicker of candles on the altar casts trembling shadows, and you're a silent observer, close to a heavy curtain where Henry VIII, hidden from view, mutters prayers with a priest in late January 1547. His labored breathing, that pained rasp we heard in his sick room, punctuates the sacred hush. You're here to probe the king's religious turmoil, the final questions of faith that haunt him as death looms. His soul caught between the Catholic roots he knew and the Protestant reforms he unleashed. This is Henry's last wrestle with eternity, and you're feeling the weight of his doubt, heavy as the crucifix glinting above. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's religious stance in 1547 was a complex mix of Catholic tradition and Protestant reform, as seen in his final will and the Act of 6 Articles 1539. He broke with Rome to form the Church of England, but kept Catholic practices like the Mass, rejecting Lutheran extremes. Now, dying, he faces judgment, his soul's fate tied to decades of upheaval, dissolving monasteries, executing Catholics and Protestants alike. You're catching the priest's low voice, urging confession, and Henry's weak reply, his words slurred by pain or fear. You're sensing his struggle. Does God see him as a reformer or a heretic, a king or a sinner? Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry reportedly clutched a relic in his final days, a supposed fragment of the True Cross, gifted by a French ambassador years earlier. In 1547, chamber accounts mention this splinter, kept in a gold reliquary by his bed, as a comfort against death's terror. You're picturing his swollen fingers fumbling for it, and grinning despite the gravity. It's like clinging to a lucky charm when the stakes are your soul. You're half wondering if he believes its power, or just needs something tangible, a king grasping at divinity as his body fails. But not everyone agrees on Henry's spiritual state. Historians still argue whether he died at peace with his faith, or tormented by doubt, with no clear confession in surviving records. Some, citing his will's Catholic tone, say he leaned back to tradition, seeking absolution. Others, noting his Protestant counsel, argue he embraced reform, trusting Edward's path. You're listening to his halting prayers, the priest's murmurs, and wondering if he's begging forgiveness for Anne Boleyn's blood or trusting his church to save him, his soul as conflicted as the kingdom he leaves. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's prayers sound so shaky? Because even God was tired of his flip-flopping. You're chuckling softly, but the chapel's solemnity stifles it. A monk's rustling robe makes you freeze. You're edging closer to the curtain, the candlelight your guide, as you strain to hear the king's words. Picture the scene. The chapel's small but grand, with a carved altar, velvet cushions, and a faint echo of Edward's prayers from days ago. You're not in the privy chamber's scheming buzz or the sick room's fetid gloom. You're in a sacred pause, where Henry's faith faces its final test. He's propped on pillows behind the curtain, too weak to kneel, his voice a ghost of the roar that once shook courts. You're feeling the intimacy, a king stripped to a man, confronting the God he both defied and served. Catherine Parr, absent now, left him to this priest, her Protestant leanings a quiet influence. You're sensing the tension, his legacy 6 wives, a fractured church hanging in the balance of these prayers. Step closer to the altar and notice the details. The cool stone under your knees, the faint drip of wax from a candle, the way the crucifix looms like a judge. This chapel's a refuge, like those ciphered letters hiding plots. But it's also a courtroom. You're thinking of the court's factions we navigated, how they bet on Edward's faith, and the Queen's fates, tied to Henry's religious wars. His faith shaped England, breaking Rome, burning heretics. But now it's personal, a question of salvation. You're wondering if he fears hell, if the relic's weight comforts or mocks him, or if he trusts his church to carry him home. The priest's voice rises, urging repentance, and you're feeling the urgency, like a clock ticking out. Here's another chuckle. Why was Henry's relic so shiny? Because it polished his sins better than his crown. You're smiling, but it's fleeting. His cough, wet and weak, pulls you back. You're also thinking about the stakes. The court's scheming, those Seymours pushing Protestantism, hinges on Henry's end. If he dies Catholic, Mary's hopes rise. If Protestant, Edward's path is set. You're remembering the sick room's pulleys, lifting a king who can't rise, and how his faith lifts nothing now, just questions. The chapel ties it all: court, pain, succession into a knot of doubt, and you're wondering if Henry sees the chaos he's leaving, or only the eternity ahead. As you rise from your knees, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just a king's prayer, it's the end of a reign that broke and built a church. now breaking its maker. You're thinking of those puppy plasters, futile against pain, and how faith feels futile here. Yet Henry clings. The court's plots, Edward's future, Parr's steady hand, they converge in this chapel, where a king's soul hangs in the balance. You're wondering about the boy king, if he'll carry his father's faith, and the England teetering on. This moment, the candles burn lower, Henry's voice fades, and you're carrying his turmoil, ready to watch the servants who bear his decay's silent burden. One last joke to ease us forward. Why was the chapel so quiet? Because Henry's sins were louder than his prayers. You're slipping from the curtain, the altar's glow dimming, as the priest's voice trails off. With Henry's faith heavy in your heart, you're ready to see the servants who tended his dying body, their labor a quiet echo of his end. You're slipping through the shadowed backstairs of Surmise Palace, where the air smells of damp straw and the faint, acrid bite of lye soap from buckets left by scurrying maids. The creak of wooden steps under your imaginary boots blends with the distant groan of Henry VIII's trussing bed, a sound that haunts these halls in late January 1547. You're a silent observer, trailing a weary servant, a groom of the stool, no less, whose hands tremble as he carries a tray of soiled bandages toward the laundry. You're here to watch the silent burden of the servants who tend Henry's decaying body, their labor a grim dance of duty and dread as the king's life fades. This is the unseen heart of the palace, and you're feeling the weight of their exhaustion, heavy as the linens they haul. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's household servants, particularly the gentlemen and grooms of the Privy Chamber, were tasked with intimate care during his final weeks. As noted in chamber accounts from January 1547, these men, elite but burdened, changed his bandages, wiped his fevered brow, and operated the pulley-rigged trussing bed we glimpsed, managing ulcers that oozed and a body too heavy to move. You're watching the groom, his face pale under a cap, as he sets down the tray, his shoulders slumped from hours of lifting a king who once lifted England. Their work was vital but grueling, a secret kept from the court's glittering facade, to avoid whispers of royal weakness. Here's a quirky tidbit. Servants sometimes used smoke baths, burning herbs like rosemary under Henry's bed to purify the sickroom's air. In 1547, household logs list bundles of lavender and thyme for this ritual, believed to chase away miasmas. You're picturing a groom fanning smoke, coughing as it stings his eyes, and grinning at the absurdity. It's like a medieval aromatherapy session, but for a king who smells worse than the herbs. You're half wondering if the groom hopes the smoke hides his own fear, his hands shaking as he tends a monarch whose death could upend his world. But not everyone agrees on the servant's mindset. Historians still argue whether these men worked out of loyalty or fear, with no personal accounts to clarify their feelings. Some, citing the Privy Chamber's high status, say they served with pride, honored to tend their king. Others, noting the era's harsh discipline, argue they feared punishment, whippings, or dismissal if they faltered. You're studying the groom's tight jaw, his quick glance toward the door, and wondering if he's devoted to Henry or just desperate to survive the court's scrutiny. His labor a mirror to the faction scheming we heard in the Privy Chamber. Time for a quick joke. Why did the servant carry so many bandages? Because Henry's wounds outranked his own sleep. You're chuckling, but it's hushed. The backstairs are no place for noise, and another servant's footsteps keep you alert. You're dodging a spilled bucket. The lies sting sharp as you follow the groom's path. Picture the scene. The passage is narrow, lit by a single rushlight, its walls stained with years of damp and toil. You're not in the chapel with Henry's prayers or the Privy Chamber's plots. You're in the palace's underbelly, where servants bear the raw truth of the king's decay. The groom's tray holds bloodied cloths, their stench a grim echo of those ulcers we saw festering. Other servants' maids, yeomen move like specters, hauling linens, fetching water, or burning those herbs in a futile bid to mask the sick room's reek. You're feeling their exhaustion, their hands chapped from scrubbing, their eyes hollow from nights spent lifting a 350-pound king. Catherine Parr might direct them, but they're the ones knee-deep in his pain. Step closer to a laundry alcove, and notice the details. The rough hemp of the bandages, the faint crackle of a fire under a cauldron, the way the groom's breath clouds in the chilly air. This space is a grindstone, like the trussing bed's pulleys, but it's human, vital. You're thinking of those puppy plasters we laughed at. Their absurdity no match for the servant's task cleaning wounds that won't heal, soothing a king who can't be saved. Their work's a secret, like the ciphered letters of plotting. Nobles, but it's raw, physical, tying them to Henry's body in a way the court avoids. You're wondering how they cope, if they whisper fears of plague or pray for the king's soul, their lives tethered to his fading pulse. Here's another chuckle. Why were the servants' hands so rough? Because they scrubbed away Henry's. Rain one bandage at a time. You're smiling, but it's fleeting. The groom's muttered curse as he drops a cloth pulls you back. You're also thinking about the court above, those Seymours and Howards we saw, their schemes floating over this drudgery. The servants know the truth. Henry's dying. His pain we felt is no rumor, but they can't speak it, bound by the same treason laws that silence the court. You're remembering Edward's diary, his boyish hopes, and the Queen's portraits. Their fates distant from this labor. The servant's burden is the palace's pulse, unseen but essential, and you're feeling their quiet strength, like a river under ice, as you trail the groom toward a steaming cauldron. You're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just about cleaning, it's about carrying a king's end. Each bandage a thread in England's unraveling. You're thinking of those smoke baths, masking decay, and how these servants masked their own fears. Their work a bridge between Henry's pain and the court's plots. The faction's whispers, Edward's prayers, Parr's steady hand. They rest on these calloused hands, unnoticed but holding the palace together. You're wondering about the groom, if he dreams of rest or dreads the chaos of Henry's death. The rushlight dims, the cauldron's steam rises, and you're carrying their silent toil, ready to watch the succession's tense countdown as the king's end nears. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did the servant's tray wobble? Because it carried more than just the king's pain. You're slipping from the alcove, the back stairs darkening as the groom's figure fades. With the servant's burden heavy in your heart, you're ready to sense the kingdom bracing for Henry's final breath, the edge of a new era. You're perched on a stone bench in Sir Mi's Palace's frosty outer courtyard, where the air bites with the chill of late January 1547 and smells of damp wool and smoldering braziers. The crunch of boots on gravel mingles with the low hum of nervous voices. Courtiers, clerks, and guards, their faces tight as they glance toward the king's sealed chambers. You're a silent observer, feeling the pulse of a kingdom on edge, as Henry VIII's final days tick down like a faltering clock. His pain, that searing agony we felt in his sick room, and the servants' grim labor we witnessed, signal the end is near. You're here to sense the tense countdown to succession, the court and country bracing for Henry's death and the rise of 9-year-old Edward. This is England holding its breath, and you're caught in the quiet storm, heavy as the frost settling round you. The mainstream fact is that by late January 1547, Henry VIII's imminent death prompted intense preparations for Edward VI's succession. as detailed in Privy Council records and the king's final will. The council, aware of Henry's critical state fevers, ulcers, and immobility, worked in secret to ensure a smooth transition, naming Edward Seymour and others to a regency council for the boy king. You're catching a clerk's hurried whisper about the will as he scurries past, his papers clutched tight, and you're sensing the urgency. Edward's coronation must be swift to avoid chaos, with England's religious divide and empty treasury threatening revolt. The court's factions, those Seymours and Howards we saw plotting, are aligning for power, and you're feeling the stakes, sharp as the icicles glinting overhead. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some courtiers wore mourning rings preemptively, simple bands engraved with skulls, to signal loyalty when Henry died. In 1547, jewelers' accounts note a rush for these grim accessories, slipped on in secret to curry favor with Edward's future court. You're picturing a nervous lord fiddling with one under his glove, his eyes darting and grinning at the grim fashion statement. It's like wearing a bumper sticker for a funeral that hasn't happened yet. You're half tempted to check your own fingers, but the cold keeps you still. Your imaginary cloak no match for the wind. But not everyone agrees on the kingdom's readiness. Historians still argue whether England was poised for stability or teetering on collapse as Henry's death loomed, with no consensus in council minutes or ambassadorial reports. Some, citing the council's swift planning, say it prevented civil war. Others, noting religious riots in 1549, argue the transition was fragile, with Edward's youth and factional rivalries a recipe for unrest. You're watching a guard stamp his feet, his breath clouding, and wondering if he trusts the council's plan or fears a Catholic uprising. The kingdom's fate as uncertain as the clouds scudding above. Time for a quick joke. Why did the courtiers' ring look so grim? Because it knew Henry's crown was heavier than his coffin. You're chuckling, but it's soft. The courtyard's tension smothers mirth, and a passing priest's frown keeps you quiet. You're shifting on the bench, the stone numbing your legs as you soak in the scene. Picture the scene. The courtyard's alive but subdued, with braziers casting red glows on faces drawn with worry. You're not in the servants' backstairs or Henry's chapel with its prayers. You're in the open, where the kingdom's pulse beats loudest. Nobles in heavy cloaks whisper of Edward's council. Their voices clipped. Seymour's name rises. Often, his Protestant push a lightning rod. You're feeling the countdown. Each day Henry lingers, tightening the screws. The court's preparing for mourning, but also for power. Heralds ready proclamations. Clerks draft coronation plans. You're sensing the fragility, like a frozen pond cracking underfoot, as England braces for a child king amid war debts and religious splits. Step closer to a brazier and notice the details. The warm flicker on your hands, the faint crackle of burning logs, the way a courtier's mourning ring catches the light. This courtyard's a crucible, like the Privy Chamber's plots, but it's broader, tying palace to kingdom. You're thinking of those smoke baths the servants used, masking Henry's decay, and how this planning masks the chaos lurking. Catholics eyeing Mary, Protestants banking on Edward. You're wondering about the boy, his diary we glimpsed, scribbling hopes while nobles carve his future. The court's tension ties to everything: Henry's pain, the Queen's legacies, the faction's schemes, and you're feeling the strain, like a rope fraying under too much weight. Here's another chuckle. Why was the courtyard so crowded? Because everyone wanted to mourn Henry before his rivals did. You're smiling, but it's fleeting. A guard's shout scatters a group, and you're reminded of the stakes. You're also thinking about connections. The servants' labor, cleaning Henry's wounds, keeps this machine running. The chapel's prayers, seeking his soul's peace. echo the kingdom's plea for calm. You're remembering the wives, how their fates led to Edward, and the doctor's futility. Buying time for this moment, the succession's a hinge, and you're wondering if Edward's counsel will hold or crack, if England will kneel to a boy, or rise in revolt. As you rise from the bench, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This countdown isn't just about Henry's death, it's about a nation poised between order and anarchy. Each whisper a bet on the future. You're thinking of those mourning rings, signaling loyalty, and how they mirror the court's desperate grasp for control. The servants' toil, Edward's prayers, Henry's faith, they converge here. In a courtyard where a kingdom waits, you're wondering about the boy king, if he'll weather this storm, and the England he'll face, already splintering. The braziers dim, the crowd thins, and you're carrying this tense anticipation, ready to stand by as Henry takes his final breath. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did the kingdom hold its breath? Because Henry's end was louder than his reign. You're slipping from the courtyard, the frost biting, as the palace looms quiet, with the succession's tension heavy in your chest. You're ready to witness Henry's death, the moment that breaks a reign and births a new era. You're standing in the suffocating hush of Henry VIII's bedchamber at Surmise Palace, where the air is a cloying mix of infection, melted wax, and the fading scent of lavender from a feudal smoke bath. The candles are stubs now, their flames barely holding against the dark, and the trussing bed's pulleys hang still, its ropes slack. It's January 28, 1547, and you're a silent witness, pressed against the tapestried wall, as Henry lies motionless, his chest rising with shallow, rattling breaths. The physicians are gone, their potions abandoned. Only Catherine Parr, a priest, and a few loyal grooms remain, their faces etched with exhaustion. You're here to stand by as Henry breathes his last, the moment death claims a king whose pain and power shaped England. This is the end, raw and final, and you're feeling its weight, heavy as the silence swallowing the room. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, at Surmise, likely from septicemia or organ failure, triggered by his chronic ulcers and obesity, as confirmed by Privy Council announcements and ambassadorial reports. His death, at 55, ended a 37-year reign that broke England from Rome, birthed the Church of England, and reshaped succession through 6 wives. You're watching his chest falter, each breath a struggle, as Parr kneels beside him, her hand steady on his. The priest murmurs last rites, and you're sensing the finality. No more decrees, no more rages, just a man slipping into eternity, leaving a boy king and a fractured realm. Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry's deathbed was sprinkled with holy water mixed with salt, a Tudor ritual to ward off evil spirits at the moment of passing. In 1547, Chapel records note a vial of this blessed mix, flicked over the king's bed by the priest. You're picturing the priest's shaky hand, splashing drops on the covers, and grinning despite the solemnity. It's like a medieval ghost repellent, useless against the death already here. You're half wondering if Henry, in his final haze, felt its sting, or just the pain we saw gripping him. His relic of the true cross now forgotten by the bedside. But not everyone agrees on Henry's final state. Historians still argue whether he died at peace, accepting his fate, or in turmoil, haunted by his sins, with no clear account of his last words. Some, citing the priest's presence and Parr's calm, say he embraced death with Catholic rites. Others, noting his Protestant counsel, argue he clung to reform, perhaps fearing divine judgment for his bloody reign. You're watching his eyes, half open but unseeing, and wondering if he's at rest or wrestling with the ghosts of Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, or the monasteries he raised. His soul as heavy as the body pinning him down. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's last breath sound so faint? Because even death couldn't ouch out his ego. You're chuckling, but it's barely a whisper. The room's too sacred for noise, and a groom's weary glance keeps you still. You're edging closer to the bed. The waxes drip loud in the quiet as you take in the scene. Picture the scene. The bedchamber's a tomb. Its tapestries black in the dim, the brazier cold, and the trussing bed a silent monument to Henry's decay. You're not in the courtyard's tense countdown or the chapel's prayers. You're at the edge of history, where a king's life ends. Henry's face is gray, his swollen frame sinking into the mattress. No longer the titan we saw in padded doublets. Par's eyes are steady, her role as nursemaid complete, while the priest's voice, soft with Latin, seals the rite. You're feeling the moment's gravity, a rain collapsing in a single, faltering breath. The kingdom beyond this room unaware but poised for upheaval. The grooms stand frozen, their labor done, their silent burden we watched now lifted. Yet, heavier with grief, step closer to the bed and notice the details. The sour reek of unhealed ulcers, the faint creak of the floor under Par's weight, the way a candle's flame gutters as if sensing the end. This room's a crucible, like the Privy Chamber's plots, but it's final, stripped of ambition. You're thinking of those mourning rings the courtiers wore, signaling loyalty, and how this moment demands none just presence. Henry's death ties everything: the servants' toil, Edward's prayers, the faction's schemes, the Queen's legacies into a single, still point. You're wondering what he sees, if heaven or hell awaits, or if he's simply too tired. His pain we felt finally easing as life slips away. Here's another chuckle. Why was the sick room so still? Because Henry's crown was too heavy for ghosts to lift. You're smiling, but it's tender. His final cough, barely audible, pulls you back. You're also thinking about the aftermath. The court's tension, that countdown we sensed, explodes now. Seymour's Protestants, Howard's Catholics, all poised to leap. You're remembering the chapel's relic, Henry's last grasp at faith, and how it contrasts with this stark end. No miracles left. The priest finishes. Par bows her head, and you're feeling the shift, like a tide turning, as England's past dies with its king, and Edward's future begins. Fragile and untested as Henry's chest stills, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just a death, it's a pivot, closing a reign that broke a church, married 6 queens, and birthed a boy king. You're thinking of those smoke baths, masking decay, and how this moment unmasks everything: Henry's power, his pain, his humanity, the court's plots, the servants' hands, Par's resolve. They converge here, where a king's end reshapes a nation. You're wondering about Edward, the boy we saw praying, and the England he'll face, already cracking. The candles wink out, the room darkens, and you're carrying this final breath, ready to watch the mourning and maneuvers that follow. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did Henry's death feel so quiet? Because his reign roared loud enough for eternity. You're slipping from the bed, the priest's voice fading as the room seals its secret. With Henry's death heavy in your heart, you're ready to observe England's reaction, the court's swift plotting as a new era dawns. You're standing in the frost-bitten great hall of Surmise Palace, where the air smells of charred logs and the faint tang of spiced wine left in scattered goblets. It's January 29, 1547, and the news of Henry VIII's death, that final breath we witnessed in his bedchamber, is rippling through the court like a stone dropped in a still pond. The hall's abuzz with hushed voices, courtiers in black velvet clasping hands or exchanging sharp glances, while heralds prepare to proclaim Edward VI's ascension. You're a silent observer, here to watch England's reaction to the king's passing and the court's swift maneuvering as factions seize the moment to shape a new reign. This is a kingdom in mourning but alive with ambition, and you're feeling the electric shift, like the air before a storm breaks. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547, triggered immediate action to secure Edward VI's succession, as detailed in Privy Council records and contemporary chronicles like Edward Hall's. The council, led by Edward Seymour, delayed public announcement for 2 days to consolidate power, proclaiming Edward king on January 31st while arranging his coronation for February 20th. You're catching a noble's urgent whisper. Seymour moves to fast as he adjusts a mourning ring, and you're sensing the choreography. Tears for Henry, but eyes on the boy king, with England's religious divide and war debts fueling rapid plots. The court's grief is real but calculated, a mask for the power grab we saw brewing in the Privy Chamber. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tudor mourners sometimes wore weeping veils dyed with onion juice to induce tears, ensuring a properly sorrowful display at royal funerals. In 1547, tailors' accounts note orders for these veils, used by courtiers to fake grief for Henry. You're picturing a lady dabbing one to her eyes, her sobs convincing but her mind on Seymour's next move, and grinning at the theatrics like a medieval Oscar performance, all for show. You're half tempted to sniff the air for onions, but the hall's somber mood keeps you focused. Your imaginary cloak blending with the mourner's black. But not everyone agrees on the nation's response. Historians still argue whether England mourned Henry sincerely or welcomed his death as relief, with no unified voice in surviving letters or sermons. Some, citing elegies praising his strength, say the people grieved their Lion King. Others, noting his tyrannical taxes and religious purges, argue many, especially Catholics, saw Edward's reign as a fresh start. You're watching a clerk scribble a proclamation, his quill unsteady, and wondering if he's mourning Henry or fearing the chaos of a child king. The hall's grief is layered as the frost outside. Time for a quick joke. Why did the courtier's veil smell so strange? Because his tears were spiced with ambition. You're chuckling softly, but the hall's tension smothers it. A guard's clank of armor makes you shrink back. You're edging past a table strewn with cups, the wine scent sharp as you soak in the scene. Picture the scene. The hall's vast but heavy, with tapestries dimmed by candlelight and a makeshift altar draped in black for Henry's soul. You're not in the sick room's fetid hush or the courtyard's icy countdown. You're in a space of transition, where mourning meets maneuvering. Nobles cluster, their black cloaks like raven wings. Seymour's men boast of Edward's Protestant future, while Howard allies, sidelined by Norfolk's fall, whisper of Mary's claim. You're feeling the split, the kingdom teetering as it buries one king and crowns another. Heralds rehearse Edward's titles, their voices flat, while maids sweep silently, remnants of the servant's burden we saw. You're sensing the rush, grief of formality as power shifts faster than the candles burn. Step closer to the altar and notice the details. The cool brass of a candelabrum, the faint hum of a chanted prayer, the way a noble's mourning ring glints with a skull's grin. This hall's a stage, like the Privy Chamber's plots, but it's public, raw. You're thinking of those weeping veils, masking true feelings, and how this mourning masks the court's hunger. Seymour's already eyeing the Lord Protector role, his Protestant push clear. while others Dudley, Cranmer jockey for council seats. You're wondering about Edward, the boy we saw praying, now a king too young to rule. His diary's hopes buried under adult schemes. The court's moves tied to everything Henry's pain. Par's resolve. The faction's ciphers, and you're feeling the momentum, like a river breaking its banks. Here's another chuckle. Why was the hall's grief so loud? Because it drowned out the sound of Seymour's plans. You're smiling, but it's brief. A priest's solemn nod pulls you back. You're also thinking about England beyond. London's bells will soon toll. Villages will pray. But the divide, Catholic versus Protestant, rich versus poor, looms. You're remembering the queens, how their fates led to Edward, and the servants' bandages, cleaning a king now gone. The mourning's a ritual, but the maneuvers are the pulse, shaping a reign before Edward's crown is sized. You're wondering if the people will rally or rebel, if Seymour's grip will hold or crack under the weight of a fractured realm. As you drift toward a side door, you're starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just a funeral, it's a rebirth, a kingdom shedding Henry's shadow to face Edward's uncertain light. You're thinking of those smoke baths, hiding decay, and how this mourning hides ambition. The court's true face, the servants' toil, Edward's prayers, Henry's last rites, they converge here. Where grief fuels power, you're wondering about the boy king, if he'll rise above this scramble, and the England he'll lead. Already straining, the hall's candles dim, the whispers sharpen, and you're carrying this moment's charge, ready to reflect on how Henry's death reshaped a nation's future. One last joke to ease us forward. Why did the court mourn so fast? Because Edward's crown was waiting to steal the show. You're slipping from the hall, the altar's glow fading, as the mourners' voices trail off. With England's reaction heavy in your heart, you're ready to explore Henry's lasting legacy, the echoes of a king whose end changed everything. You're settled on a cushioned bench in a quiet antechamber of Surmise Palace, where the air smells of aged wood and the faint ash of a dying fire in the hearth. The February light of 1547 filters through a narrow window, casting a soft glow on a tapestry of Henry VIII in his prime, golden, fierce, untouchable. His death, that final breath we stood by, is days past, and the court hums with Edward VI's coronation plans. But you're here to reflect on the legacy of Henry's horrible end, how his pain-racked passing reshaped England's future. The palace feels different now, lighter but uncertain, and you're tracing the threads of a king's life, his loves, wars, and reforms that linger like the ember's warmth. This is the echo of a titan, and you're feeling its weight, gentle as the fading light. The mainstream fact is that Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547, marked a pivotal shift for England, ending a transformative reign and ushering in Edward VI's Protestant-leaning rule. As chronicled in state papers and Edward Hall's chronicle, his break with Rome, 6 marriages, and religious reforms dissolving monasteries, founding the Church of England left a fractured but dynamic nation, poised between Catholic tradition and Protestant zeal. You're picturing Edward's coronation, a boy in oversized robes, and sensing Henry's shadow. His death didn't just pass a crown but cemented a legacy of religious upheaval, a navy strengthened for war, and a succession tied to his children Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. His pain, those ulcers we winced at, closed a chapter, but his choices echo, shaping England's path. Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry's funeral included a wax effigy, dressed in his robes, paraded through London to awe the crowds. In 1547, Undertaker's records describe this lifelike figure, its face molded from his death mask, carried on a chariot to Westminster Abbey. You're imagining it rolling past, the crowd hushed, and grinning at the macabre show. It's like a Tudor action figure, a final flex of royal pomp. You're half wondering if the effigy hid the decay we smelled in his sick room, a polished farewell to a king whose flaws were as grand as his deeds. It's wax and nod to the mourning veils we saw, but not everyone agrees on Henry's legacy. Historians still argue whether his death strengthened England by centralizing power, or weakened it by sowing religious discord, with no consensus in chronicles or modern studies. Some, citing his navy and legal reforms, say he built a modern state. Others, pointing to the 1549 rebellions, argue his policies left a volatile mess for Edward's council. You're gazing at the tapestry, Henry's painted eyes fierce, and wondering if he'd see himself as England's savior or its storm. His death a release or a spark for chaos. The court's maneuvers we watched already fraying under Edward's youth. Time for a quick joke. Why did Henry's effigy look so smug? Because it outlasted his temper and his ulcers. You're chuckling softly, the fire's crackle blending with your breath. Because this moment's yours, a pause to reflect. For now, you're alone. The palace's buzz distant as you weave Henry's story. Picture the scene. The antechamber's cozy, with oak paneling, a faded rug, and the tapestry's threads glinting like memories. You're not in the great hall's mourning or the sick room's gloom. You're in a space of echoes, where Henry's life feels both vast and close. His death, that still moment we felt, wasn't just an end, it was a hinge, swinging England toward Protestant reform, a stronger crown, but also unrest. You're thinking of Edward, the boy we saw praying, now king, his diary's hopes tested by Seymour's grip. The Queen's fates, those portraits we lingered by, led to this Jane's son, Elizabeth's future. You're sensing the legacy's scope, from monasteries raised to a navy sailing, all born of Henry's will and wounds. The step closer to the fire, and notice the details. The warm flicker on your hands, the faint creak of the bench, the way the tapestries Henry seems to watch, his rain frozen. This room's a haven, like those mourning rings signaling loyalty, but it's also a lens. You're thinking of the servant's bandages, cleaning his decay, and how his death cleaned a slate, letting Edward's council dream anew. The court's plots, the chapel's prayers, par's steady hand their threads in this legacy, tying Henry's pain to England's rebirth. You're wondering about the nation now. Will it heal under Edward, or crack under Mary's Catholic return? His reforms, his wars, his loves, they ripple, like the fire's glow, into a future he'll never see. Here's another chuckle. Why was Henry's legacy so loud? Because his crown shouted longer than his coughs. You're smiling, but it's tender. The tapestries Henry feels like a ghost, his death a door to tomorrow. You're also thinking about ties, the physician's potions, the courtier's fears, the succession's tension. They all converge in this legacy, a king who broke and built, loved and lost. You're remembering the smoke baths, masking his end, and how his legacy masks nothing now, its flaws and triumphs bare. You're wondering about Elizabeth, a queen unborn, who'll carry his fire, and the England they'll share, forged in this moment's quiet shift. Now, let's soften the world. Let the edges blur like a dream. You're still on that bench, the fire's embers glowing faint, their warmth a gentle hug against the February chill. The tapestry fades, Henry's golden figure dissolving into the antechamber's hush. His death a whisper now, carried away like ash on the wind. You're breathing slower, the palace's weight lifting, its plots and pains melting into a distant hum, like waves lapping a far shore. You've walked with kings, queens, and servants, felt their fears, their hopes, and that's enough. Picture a quiet field, the one beyond Whitehall's walls, its grass silver under moonlight, where Henry's shadow rests, joined by Edward's prayers, Parr's resolve. The crowns, the ulcers, the veils, they're gone, leaving only peace, a kingdom dreaming under stars. Let the fire dim, let the silence cradle you. Your heart's full, your eyes heavy, and the night's ready to hold you close. Sleep now, sweet listener, and drift with England's echoes, soft as the embers glow.